Nurse Nightingale to the ER. Nurse Nightingale to the ER. The overhead page crackled through Oak Creek Memorial's third floor at 0847, and the Snickers rippled down the corridor like dominoes falling. Brooke Sullivan didn't break stride. She didn't look up from the medication cart she was restocking. She didn't acknowledge the resident who turned away, shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter, or the nursing assistant who pretended suddenly to be very interested in a blank supply requisition form. Dr. Hayes had been using that call sign for 11 days straight, ever since she'd quietly corrected his dosage calculation in front of the surgical team. Not loudly. Not publicly in the way he was doing this now. She'd simply leaned close during rounds and said, "Micrograms, not milligrams, sir." That was all. One correction. One factual error prevented. And now the name followed her like smoke, Nurse Nightingale, said with the tone of something precious, and precious things were always, always mockable. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in their endless mechanical chorus, casting harsh shadows across the tired faces of the morning shift. The smell of antiseptic mingled with burnt coffee from the nurse's station. Someone had left a pot brewing since before dawn. Brooke moved through the third-floor corridor with the efficiency of someone who had done this same route 2,000 times before. 8-bed ward. For post-op patients. 2 ready for discharge. 1 waiting for pathology results. 2 empty. Her hands were steady as she checked vital signs, blood pressure normal, oxygen saturation good, dressing dry and intact. The kind of work nobody noticed when it was done right. The kind of work that saved lives before they even knew they were in danger. Her fingers found the dog tag beneath her scrubs, a habit now, automatic as breathing. The chain was broken, had been for 3 years, so the metal disc hung loose against her chest, tethered only by a thin cord she'd knotted through the loop. A single name stamped into the brass. A unit designation. A blood type that nobody here knew matched her own. She didn't consciously touch it. Her hand just moved there when the noise in her head got too loud. When the memory of Sanjin tried to surface. When someone said Nurse Nightingale in a tone that was meant to diminish her. Dr. Hayes passed her in the hallway at 0903. His white coat was pristine, expensive, Italian linen, probably, the kind that cost more than Brooke's entire shift pay. His phone was pressed to his ear and he was laughing about something a pharmaceutical rep had said. He didn't look at her. He never did anymore. The easy familiarity they'd had when she'd first started at Oak Creek, the kind exchanged during rounds, the joke about the coffee being worse than battlefield rations, all of that had evaporated after the dosage correction. What he didn't know was that Brooke had been watching him too. Not consciously. Not maliciously. But her mind worked like it had been trained to work, observe, assess, calculate. She'd noticed that his surgical supply orders were running roughly 300% above the hospital's standard cost metrics. She'd noticed that the equipment he was requesting didn't match the inventory in the actual OR. She'd noticed the pattern, order submitted Tuesday, invoice processed Wednesday, equipment mysteriously abundant by Friday even though the stock sheets didn't reflect new receipts. Her by-the-book inventory checks, the ones she conducted every morning at 0600, the ones that took exactly 43 minutes and accounted for every syringe, every drape, every sterile field, those checks were creating a paper trail he couldn't afford. She didn't know this was why he hated her. She only knew he did. At 0934, an hour into the shift, Dr. Hayes cornered her in the supply closet between the pharmacy and the medication refrigerator. The space was narrow, barely 6 feet deep, lined with cardboard boxes of syringes and gauze packs stacked like building blocks. The fluorescent strip light inside cast everything in a sickly white glow. She was reaching for a box of 4 catheters when his voice came from behind her, low and sharp, the kind of voice that didn't raise volume to convey threat. The kind that had learned threat in other ways, in other places. "You're making waves, Sullivan." She turned. He was standing in the doorway, blocking it, his arms at his sides in a posture that suggested he'd been trained in intimidation or naturally inclined toward it. Probably both. Questioning my orders. In front of residents. In front of the surgical team. His jaw was tight. His eyes were the color of chips of flint. I've got 3 write-ups ready to go. 3 documented instances of insubordination and failure to respect chain of command. All I need is 1 more misstep and you're done here. Finished. Terminated for cause, which means no reference, no severance, and every hospital in this state gets a call from my attorney. She didn't respond. The training from Sanjin had taught her that silence was sometimes the most powerful thing a person could offer. That giving someone words to work with, reactions to feed off, only made them stronger. So she held his gaze, not challenging, just level, and waited for him to finish. Do you understand me? His voice got quieter. That was worse. Quieter meant he'd moved from simple intimidation to something more calculated. Something that suggested he'd done this before. 1 more error on your part. 1 more inventory discrepancy that doesn't add up. 1 more question about my procedures. And I will personally make sure you never work in nursing again. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Inside her chest, a small thing broke, not her composure, never her composure, but something internal that had been held together by the simple assumption that competence mattered. That doing your job right was enough. That keeping people alive was worth something in a system that supposedly valued keeping people alive. Understood, sir, she said. 8 words. Quiet. Deferential. The way she'd learned to speak to officers in another life, another uniform. He held her eyes for 3 more seconds. Then he stepped back, let her pass. She slid past him in the narrow space, close enough to smell his cologne, something expensive that didn't match the sweat underneath it, and walked out of the supply closet without hurrying. Her heart rate was elevated, but she controlled her breathing. She'd done harder things. She'd done things that made being cornered in a supply closet by a man whose threat was mostly status seem almost quaint by comparison. The rest of the morning blurred into routine. Vital signs. Medication administration. Charting in the electronic medical record system. A discharge. 2 new admits from the ER, both stable, both routine. She was competent and invisible, exactly as she'd always been. Nobody watched her. Nobody listened to the conversation she had with patients because she was just a nurse, just the person who changed the dressings and hung me 4 bags and made sure the morphine orders came through on time. At 14:47, during shift change in the parking lot where the outgoing staff collected to gossip about difficult patients and bully nurses who made mistakes, Dr. Hayes made his move. Brooke was walking toward the elevator bank to head upstairs. She'd picked up an extra shift, volunteering for the night rotation because money was tight and her son's after-school care was expensive, when his voice cut across the crowd. Not loud. Measured. The kind of announcement made by someone confident that everyone would listen. Sullivan, you're off the surgical rotation effective immediately. General floor nursing, all shifts. I'm reassigning you due to attitude problems and failure to respect the chain of command. Effective today. The parking lot went quiet. The kind of quiet where you could hear the exhaust from the air conditioning units in the basement level, the distant sound of ambulance sirens from downtown, the shuffle of shoes as people shifted their weight and pretended not to be watching. This was a public humiliation. This was strategic. This was the move of someone who understood that breaking a person sometimes meant breaking them in front of witnesses so nobody would believe their account of it later. Brooke looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once. Of course, doctor. I'll report to the floor supervisor. She turned and walked toward the elevator without another word. Her jaw was tight, tight enough that her molars ached, but her hands were steady. Her voice hadn't wavered. And underneath her scrubs, her fingers found the dog tag again, that small weight of brass that had survived Sanjin and medevac flights and 2 years of therapy and seemed now to be the only thing in the world that understood what it was like to carry weight that nobody else could see. The elevator doors opened. The fluorescent light inside was harsh and unforgiving. She stepped in and pressed the button for the 3rd floor, and as the doors closed, she let herself breathe. Just once. just for the second it took for her to gather the pieces of herself back together into something that resembled a civilian nurse who didn't know how to do things like direct cardiac massage or emergency surgical procedures in the field. She was still breathing steadily when the doors opened again. The overhead page crackled at 2,140 hours, cutting through the general ward's fluorescent hum. ER personnel report to triage for multi-vehicle, all available hands. Brooke was restocking the medication dispensary on the 3rd floor when the call came through, her hands moving through the routine with the kind of muscle memory that didn't require thought anymore. Dexamethasone. Morphine. Lorazepam. Each vial returned to its slot in alphabetical order, precise and methodical. The page repeated. She finished the row, set down the cart, and headed for the stairs without rushing. Hayes was somewhere in this building. She'd seen his Lexus in the physician's lot during her break, the vanity plate still reading Dreisand like a child's toy. But he wasn't in the ER, and that meant 3 hours where she could work without feeling his eyes on the back of her neck. The ER bay smelled like diesel exhaust and antiseptic, that sharp chemical tang that cut through everything else. The ambulance bays were a controlled chaos, gurneys rolling in 2 at a time, techs calling out vitals, residents moving with the kind of purposeful speed that comes from actual training. A 5-car pileup on I-95, heading westbound near the Riverside exit. 2 critical, for moderate, 3 walking. The triage nurse, Martinez, quick hands, seen everything twice, was assigning beds and calling out assignments. Brooke moved into the flow without needing direction. This was the rotation Hayes had given her. General floor coverage. Whatever the ER needed. She found herself grateful for it now. Then the bay doors opened differently. No sirens. No radio chatter from dispatch. Just a black SUV with government plates, sleek and purposeful, pulling around back like it had every right to. 2 men in tactical gear wheeled out a backboard. The patient was conscious, mid-40s, built like someone who spent his life swimming in dark water and climbing mountains that didn't want him on them. Commander Nathan Cross, according to the intake sheet that materialized in Martinez's hands. Navy SEAL. Training exercise. Shrapnel wound to the upper left chest. No name for who he was working with, no details about the exercise itself, everything stamped with that particular silence that meant classified. The one tactical operator nodded at the attending, Dr. Ortiz, like they knew each other. They probably did. Jacksonville sat 40 minutes from Naval Station Mayport. Special operations moved through Oak Creek Memorial the way they moved through everything else, directly, with minimum conversation, leaving people wondering what they'd just witnessed. Dr. Ortiz was a trauma surgeon the way some people were musicians. 32 years old, trained at Walter Reed, had credentials that made residents nervous just standing next to him. He took one look at the commander's wound, entrance track, upper mediastinal region, potentially tracking toward the great vessels, and called for OR. Get him to surgical. Now. Not a request. An order with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone move faster. Brooke found herself assigned to the surgical team by simple arithmetic, bodies available, skill level necessary, hands that would show up when needed. She didn't question it. She followed the gurney to pre-op, her movements already shifting into that different space where civilian life stopped and muscle memory took over. In the surgical holding area, she began her prep. Instrument tray layout, scalpel, retractors, sutures in ascending gauge sizes, electrocautery tips arranged by type. The scrub tech, a woman named Jessica who'd worked with Brooke on 3 previous trauma cases, watched her lay out the tray and nodded slightly. There was something about the precision of it. The way Brooke's hands knew where things needed to be without hesitation. Jessica had asked her once, months ago, "Where'd you learn to move like that?" Brooke had said, "Practice." It wasn't a lie. The commander's eyes were tracking the ceiling lights as they prepped him for anesthesia. He was the kind of calm that either came from having seen worse or from knowing his own body well enough to trust it. His hands were scarred. Really scarred. The kind of damage you get from rope work and desert operations and things that don't leave paperwork. He caught Brooke's eye for just a moment as the anesthesiologist approached with the mask, and something in his expression shifted. Barely perceptible. Recognition, maybe. Or the memory of recognition. Then the mask went on, and his consciousness slipped away. At 2,203 hours, they moved into the operating room. The space transformed the moment they crossed the threshold. Everything became geometry and intention. Surgical lights blazed down with the kind of intensity that made shadows disappear. The ventilator began its mechanical wheeze as the anesthesiologist secured the airway. Dr. Ortiz stood across the table from Brooke, already gloved, his eyes the only part of his face visible above the surgical mask. There was no wasted motion in the room. This was the kind of surgery that separated competent surgeons from people who understood trauma at a cellular level. 15 minutes into the procedure, Dr. Ortiz called for a cut down. The shrapnel track was deeper than imaging had indicated. Whoever had done the imaging had been conservative in their assessment, probably a radiologist whose worst fear was missing something and having it blow up in their face 2 hours later. The subclavian artery needed direct visualization. Brooke was already moving. She handed him the scalpel before the request fully formed in his mouth. Retractor next. The sutures, 6-0 proline for delicate vessel work, she pulled the exact gauge without being asked, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory that belonged to someone else, someone who had done this in a surgical tent in Sanjin Valley with shells falling outside and a Marine's femoral artery trying to turn him into a statistical failure. Across the table, an older surgical tech named Reyes, corporal insignia on the Marine Corps tattoo scarred into his forearm, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, watched her technique and his eyes narrowed. He'd been doing this work for 23 years. He'd seen civilians work like nurses. He'd seen military medics work like surgeons. He'd seen exactly 3 people in his entire career handle a subclavian exposure with that particular combination of precision and speed, and 2 of them had been deployed to FOB Shank in Loga Province. The surgeon's voice was low, almost conversational, the way voices got when the stakes were high enough that panic was a luxury nobody could afford. Steady hands. Good exposure. Brooke kept working. She didn't acknowledge the comment. She handed him the hemostats, kept the surgical field clear, anticipated the next move before he'd finished the current one. The ventilator wheezed its rhythmic pulse. The monitor beeped its steady pattern. The fluorescent lights held everything in perfect, terrible clarity. She was aware of Dr. Ortiz watching her more carefully now, his head tilting slightly, the way a person looks at something that doesn't quite match the category they'd placed it in. Then Reyes leaned back just slightly and whispered something to the anesthesiologist. Not loud enough for everyone to hear. Just loud enough that Brooke caught it. Camp Leatherneck. 2012, 4-vessel repair in the field. The surgical tech wasn't talking to the anesthesiologist. He was confirming something. He already knew. He just wanted to hear it out loud, maybe, to know that his 30-year-old memory wasn't fabricating things. That he really had worked with this person before, in a place where the rules were different and the costs were real, and a 28-year-old staff sergeant with steady hands and no backup had kept a colonel alive long enough for a helicopter to arrive. Brooke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her hands didn't change rhythm. They kept moving with the same precise, measured certainty. The mask she wore, the civilian one, the one that said she was just a nurse, just another set of hands in an operating room, didn't crack. Not even slightly. She handed the next instrument. Kept the field clear. Let her body do what her body knew how to do, and kept her face a perfect, empty blank. Dr. Ortiz was looking at her directly now, but she was focused on the surgical field. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't need to. The procedure continued. The subclavian artery held. The bleeding controlled. The commander's chest was closed at 2,247 hours, his sinus rhythm steady on the monitor, his blood pressure climbing back toward something that resembled consciousness. The monitor flatlined at 02 for 7 hours. The shrill alarm cut through Oak Creek Memorial Surgical Theater like a blade through silk. Sinus rhythm 1 second. Nothing the next. The commander's chest lay open beneath the surgical lights, his heart a slack muscle refusing to beat, and the room held its breath in that terrible silence that comes just before chaos. Dr. Ortiz's hands froze above the operative field. His jaw tightened. He'd trained for this, run the codes, practiced the compressions on dummies and cadavers, but the weight of it, the weight of a living man's chest open under his fingertips, the heart refusing to cooperate, that was something different. His eyes moved to the monitor. Back to the chest. Back to the monitor again. "Crash cart," he called, his voice steady but not quite automatic. "Start compressions." The surgical tech moved. The anesthesiologist was already reaching for the crash cart, wheels squeaking across tile like a protest. 30 seconds. The chest compressions were happening, but the monitor remained a flat line, that accusatory hum of failure. 1 minute. Reyes, the surgical tech, was calling out vitals that weren't there. BP undetectable. O2 sat dropping. The commander's blood pressure had fallen to nothing, his body shutting down with the indifference of machines losing power. Dr. Ortiz called for epi. 1 milligram pushed 4. Nothing. He was running the code by the book, textbook compressions, by the book timing, but Brooke could see it in his shoulders, the hesitation. The calculation. How long was too long? How many compressions before you admitted the patient was already gone? Liability. Protocol. The weight of decisions that had to be made in seconds. 2 minutes now. Brooke stepped closer to the table. Her eyes locked on the open chest cavity. The commander's heart lay there, pale and flaccid, refusing to respond to electricity and chemicals and the desperation of trained hands trying to will it back to life. She could see the pericardium, the sternum spread wide, the surgical field that had been so controlled just minutes ago now transformed into a rescue operation that was losing ground with every passing second. She didn't hesitate. Her gloved hand reached for the rib spreader. The motion was smooth, economical, the way a body moves when it's done something 10,000 times before. She widened the surgical field with movement so precise and so fast that the entire surgical team stepped back in unison, as if pulled by invisible strings. Dr. Ortiz didn't object. Something in her movements, something in the absolute absence of doubt, had already shifted the authority in that room like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface. Brooke's hands entered the commander's open chest. Her gloved fingers wrapped around his heart. The organ was still warm, still slick with blood, and she could feel the weight of it in her palms, an object that was supposed to be alive but had instead become inert. She began direct cardiac massage in steady, controlled compressions, her hands moving with the terrifying precision of someone who had done this before. Not on dummies. Not in simulations. In the field. In the dark. Under fire. "Epi, 1 milligram, now," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room like something physical. Not a request. A command. For push. The anesthesiologist moved without thinking. "Calcium chloride, 10 milliliters," Brooke continued, her eyes locked on the monitor even as her hands continued their steady rhythm. "Check the line for air. I need clean flow." The surgical tech was staring at her. Reyes. The older Marine who'd recognized her technique from Camp Leatherneck 3 segments ago. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His hands moved with automatic precision, but his eyes never left her face. In those eyes was recognition crystallizing into certainty. 2 minutes into the code now. Brooke's hands compressed the commander's heart in steady rhythm. The muscle was responding. She could feel it beginning to respond, the tissue warming slightly under the pressure of her compressions, the organ being coaxed back toward life through pure mechanical force and the kind of knowledge that comes from having stood in field hospitals watching medics work by lamplight and muzzle flash. Still asystole, the anesthesiologist reported. "Another round of epi," Brooke said. The flat certainty in her voice made it not a suggestion but a statement of fact. "Push it hard." In the observation gallery above the operating theater, staff were gathering. Word had spread through Oak Creek Memorial like electricity through copper wire, code blue in the main OR, critical situation, high-priority patient. Nurses who should have been on their assigned floors had found excuses to drift to the gallery. 2 residents. A custodial worker who'd been mopping the hallway. An intern who'd abandoned her coffee. Their faces pressed against the glass partition like children watching something incomprehensible and terrible unfold. 3 minutes now. Brooke's hands never wavered. Her posture was perfect, elbows bent at exactly the right angle, body weight driving the compressions with mechanical efficiency, her face a blank mask of focus. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the hiss of the anesthesia ventilator, the beep of the monitors, the sound of Reyes's gloved hand reaching for the next medication. The kind of quiet that settles over operating theaters when something impossible is happening and everyone is holding their breath waiting to see if it will work. The monitor remained flat. "Come on," Brooke said softly. Not to anyone in the room. To the commander. To the heart beneath her hands. "Come on." For minutes. The rhythm thread came back like a whisper. The monitor showed it first, a single blip on the screen, a return of the electrical activity that meant the heart was remembering how to beat. Brooke's hands continued their compressions, pushing, releasing, keeping the blood moving, keeping the oxygen flowing through the commander's body while his organ slowly, reluctantly, began to relearn how to work on its own. "We have a rhythm," the anesthesiologist said. His voice carried the kind of relief that comes with reprieve. "Sinus. Rate 68. BP coming up." Dr. Ortiz exhaled. Not a loud sound, just air leaving his lungs, the tension that had been wound through his entire body beginning to ease. He stepped back from the table. He'd done the right things in the right sequence, but he would know, everyone in that room would know, that it wasn't his hands that had brought the commander back. It was the woman standing across from him with the blood-soaked gloves and the face like carved stone. The gallery erupted in whispers. Not loud, professional courtesy kept the voices low, hospital etiquette maintained even in moments of shock, but the whispers were there. Nurses turning to each other. Residents exchanging glances that contained questions they didn't have words for yet. Reyes, the surgical tech, was staring at Brooke like he'd seen a ghost walk out of Camp Leatherneck and into Oak Creek Memorial Surgical Theater. His lips moved, barely forming words, but the anesthesiologist heard him. "Camp Leatherneck, 2012. For vessel repair. I watched a medic do this in a field hospital during a TIC. A tactical insertion center. Under fire." 3 segments ago, Reyes had confirmed what her hands already knew, that Brooke Sullivan had been somewhere she had no business being, had done things no civilian nurse should know how to do. Now he knew she'd done it more than once. Brooke was already moving. The immediate crisis had passed, the commander's heart was beating, his oxygen saturation was climbing back toward acceptable levels, his blood pressure had steadied to something that suggested viability, but there was still work to be done. The chest needed to be closed. The medications needed to be managed. The post-resuscitation protocol needed to be followed with the same precision that had gotten them here. She glanced up once, just for a moment, toward the observation gallery. Dr. Hayes stood in the doorway, his face the color of old parchment. His hand was gripping the frame so hard his knuckles had gone white. He'd been drawn to the OR by the emergency page like a moth to flame, had probably wanted to see the disaster unfold, had probably expected to watch the commander die and everyone in the room with him. Instead, he'd watched a nurse perform a procedure that shouldn't exist in civilian medicine, had watched her pull a patient back from the edge with hands that moved like they'd done it 1,000 times before. His eyes met Brooke's for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned and walked directly to his office. The door closed behind him with the sound of a man who understood that something had shifted fundamentally, that the structure of assumptions he'd built his entire scheme on had just developed a fault line he hadn't anticipated. He'd been so focused on destroying her through paperwork and protocol and pressure from above that he'd never considered the possibility that she might not need those systems to work at all. That she might be something else entirely. Brooke turned back to her work. The commander's chest was already being closed by Dr. Ortiz, the surgical team moving back into their assigned roles as if nothing had happened, as if a woman who wasn't supposed to know how to do this had just saved a patient no one else in the room had been able to reach. Brooke's hands moved with the same precision they'd shown during the resuscitation, checking lines, confirming medications, running through the mental checklist that meant the difference between temporary revival and actual survival. The monitor showed steady sinus rhythm. The blood pressure held at 110/68. The oxygen saturation climbed back toward normal territory. By 03:12 hours, the commander was stable enough to move to recovery, his vital signs holding, his consciousness hovering somewhere in the twilight between sedation and awareness, and everyone in Oak Creek Memorial Surgical Theater knew something had changed. They didn't know yet that they'd just watched a legend save a life. They only knew that someone in the room had answered when death had come calling, and death had blinked first. The gallery cleared slowly, whispers rising like static. Reyes walked past Brooke as she stripped off her surgical gloves, and for just a moment, their eyes met. No words. Nothing needed to be said. He'd been there. He knew. And he was already trying to reconcile the timid floor nurse who accepted humiliation without a word with the combat medic whose hands had just written a masterclass in emergency medicine on a man's open chest. Brooke moved through her post-resuscitation checklist with the same efficiency she'd shown during the code. The adrenaline that had flooded her system was already beginning to drain away, leaving behind the kind of clarity that comes only after a crisis has passed and the body realizes it's still alive. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. There was not a tremor in any of her movements. She was a nurse at Oak Creek Memorial in Jacksonville, Florida. She was also Staff Sergeant Brooke Sullivan, who had saved the lives of 47 service members in San Gin and trained the medics who saved the lives of hundreds more. She was the woman wearing a dog tag on a broken chain beneath her scrubs, the only thing she'd kept from the part of her life that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. And she was about to find out that the Pentagon had been watching. The commander's heart found its rhythm at 0315 hours. Sinus rhythm. Clean and steady. The attending surgeon looked at Brooke with something between gratitude and terror, nodded once, and began closing. She had already stepped back. Already released him to the machines and the monitors and the slow march toward recovery. Nobody thanked her. Nobody said her name. The gallery observation window emptied as quickly as it had filled, staff dispersing back to their stations, back to their own crises, back to their own lives where they would spend the next 18 hours telling the story of what they'd just witnessed without understanding a single frame of it. Brooke peeled off her gloves in the scrub room. One glove. Then the other. The latex snapped against her wrists like accusations. Blood had soaked through to her palms, not his blood anymore, but the evidence of what her hands had done. She dropped the gloves into the red biohazard container and stood for 3 seconds, just standing, staring at nothing. The ventilator in the adjacent OR wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to miracles. She turned toward the locker room without speaking to anyone. The other nurses parted to let her pass. Not out of respect. Out of something else. Something that looked like fear. Her scrubs came off in the privacy of the locker room. Brown blood crusted the cuffs where her wrists had been exposed. Blood dried dark in the creases of her knuckles. She stood at the sink in her sports bra and scrub pants, washing her hands with soap that smelled like industrial lemon, water as hot as she could stand. The water ran brown at first. Then pink. Then finally clear. She watched it spiral down the drain and thought about San Gin, about the dust, about the screaming in a language she understood well enough to know it was screaming. Pain was information. Screaming was data. Both meant the same thing, alive. She dressed in clean scrubs from the bottom drawer of her locker. The dog tag caught the fluorescent light as she pulled the shirt over her head, half a second of gleam, then covered again. Always covered. Always hidden. She had kept it on a broken chain for 8 years, never replaced it, never let it rest completely. The break was intentional. Breaks meant no hole. Hole meant closure. She wasn't ready for either. The locker room door closed behind her. The hallway was emptier than it should be at 0340 hours. Third shift was supposed to be skeleton crew, but word had spread. The code blue. The save. The woman who had reached into a man's chest with her bare hands and brought him back from flatline. Some of the nurses stared when she passed. Some looked away. One whispered something to another, and Brooke heard her own name in the fractured syllables but didn't turn. Acknowledgement would have required her to exist in their version of the story, and she needed very badly to not exist at all. Dr. Hayes was in his office by 0340. The door was locked. The blinds were drawn against the pre-dawn darkness. He sat at his desk with his personal cell phone in one hand and his desk phone in the other, and the first call he made was to Richard Garrett, the hospital board's chief financial officer and his contact for 7 years of quietly skimmed supply orders, inflated equipment costs, and the kind of favor trading that kept a man's lifestyle solvent when his salary alone could not. "We have a problem," Hayes said. His voice sounded like gravel. Tonight, 0247 hours, a surgical nurse performed an unauthorized emergency procedure. Open chest cardiac massage. No attending authorization. No protocol approval. Unsanctioned resuscitation. We need to move fast. This is a liability risk that could sink us if the lawyers get hold of it. Garrett's voice came back through the speaker. "Who's the nurse?" "Sullivan. Brooke Sullivan. Works 3rd floor, general rotation. She was down in ER tonight and ended up on a surgical team." He paused. The pause was the moment he understood. The pause was the moment he recognized what she was. She knew what she was doing, Richard. Too well. "Can you bury it?" "I'm trying." The second call came at 0352. The state nursing board had a night number for emergencies. Hayes used it. He reported a nurse who had performed medical procedures outside her scope, who had administered cardiac interventions without proper credentials, who had endangered a patient through unauthorized resuscitation techniques. He had witnesses. He could provide statements. The board representative taking the call was half asleep but took notes. An investigation would be opened. Standard procedure. Nothing guaranteed. The third call was to Martin Holloway, the attorney who had helped him draft the paperwork for 3 separate land deals and 1 offshore account. "I need a personnel file flagged," Hayes said. "Brooke Sullivan. NURSE, 3rd floor. I need you to find anything that can be used in a disciplinary hearing. Attitude problems. Patient complaints. Insubordination. Anything we can use to justify immediate termination." Holloway said, "Give me 2 hours." By 0600 hours, Brooke was summoned to the Human Resources office on the 2nd floor. She didn't ask why. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step the same distance from the last, her breathing steady as a metronome. The dog tag beneath her clean scrubs felt heavier than it should. 3 ounces of metal. Maybe 4. She had carried heavier things. Not lately. But the muscle memory was there, somewhere in her bones, in the architecture of her cells. The HR director, Patricia Mills, looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her coffee was the color of tar. "Brooke," she began, and Brooke heard the apology embedded in the syllable before the sentence even started. "I'm notifying you that as of 0600 hours, you are placed on immediate suspension pending an investigation into allegations of practicing nursing outside your scope of practice. Your badge is being deactivated. You will not be allowed to access any hospital system or facility while the investigation is ongoing." Brooke didn't move. "For how long?" "It depends on the investigation. Could be a week. Could be longer. You'll be notified by certified mail once we have a timeline. A week of being gone. A week of being nothing. A week of Tyler asking why Mom was home, why she couldn't go to work, why the job that had defined the last 8 years had suddenly erased her from its doors." "Okay," Brooke said. "Security will escort you from the building. It's protocol." "I'm sorry, but it's protocol." The escort came at 0620. A security guard named Marcus, who had always been polite and who looked genuinely uncomfortable now, as if he was being asked to escort royalty out of a building she owned. The lobby was beginning to fill with the morning shift. Nurses grabbing coffee from the cafeteria. Lab techs clocking in. A handful of visitors here for visiting hours that started at 0700. Conversation stopped when Brooke walked past. Not all at once. In sequence, like dominoes falling backward. One conversation stopped. Then another. Then 5. Then a dozen. By the time she reached the front doors, the entire lobby had gone quiet enough to hear the automatic doors hiss open like a long, slow breath being released. The parking lot was empty except for her car. A 2008 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles on it and a child safety seat in the back. She drove home in silence, her scrubs still stained with dried blood on the cuffs. She had forgotten to change them. Or she hadn't forgotten. Some part of her had wanted to carry the evidence home, to let it dry there, to prove that something real had happened even if the hospital was now pretending it hadn't. Tyler found her at the kitchen table at 0810 hours. 8 years old, bright-eyed, holding a cereal box and asking why Mom was home early. She had called the daycare to say she'd pick him up later, that something had come up, that it was complicated. They didn't ask for details. They were used to complications. The dog tag was clenched in her fist. She didn't remember taking it out. Didn't remember pulling it from beneath her shirt. It was just there, in her hand, the broken chain looped around her knuckles like a prayer that had learned to bite. The tears came before she could stop them. Not quiet tears. Not the kind that asked for permission. They came like the breathing she had done in Sanjin when the dust was so thick you could taste it, necessary, unstoppable, the body doing what it needed to do to survive the moment. Tyler set the cereal box on the table and climbed into her lap. He was getting too big for that. At 8, he was supposed to be past the age of climbing into his mother's lap. But he did it anyway, the way children do when they sense something has fundamentally shifted in the world and they need to anchor themselves to something that doesn't move. "Why are you home early?" His voice was small. Terrified. He had heard the silence in the car. He had seen the blood on her cuffs and not asked about it, which meant he had decided not to know. Brooke's jaw tightened. The mask tried to hold. For 0.3 seconds, the composure won. Then it shattered. "Something happened at work," she said quietly. "Something that means I can't go back for a little while." "Are you fired?" "I don't know yet, baby. I don't know yet." She pulled him close, and he let her, and they sat in the kitchen at 0815 hours while the sun came up over Jacksonville and the hospital went about its morning rounds without her, and the nurses who had seen what she could do began to understand that they had been standing next to something that shouldn't have been standing in their hallway at all. Something with no rank visible on a badge. Something with no credentials that matched what it could actually do. Something the institution had just tried to erase. But erasure required more than a deactivated badge. It required more than an investigation and a report and a sealed file. Across town, in the ICU, the commander was waking up for the first time since his heart had stopped. His security detail stood at the door. And the first thing he asked them was who had saved him. The first thing he did was make 2 phone calls. One to Naval Special Warfare Command. One to the Pentagon. Wheels were beginning to turn. The hospital lobby at Oak Creek Memorial was crowded during the lunch rush when the television mounted above the front desk cut to a live feed from the Pentagon. Reporters stood at attention. Cameras flashed. The cafeteria conversations died first, then rippled outward through the waiting room like shock waves through water. A news anchor's voice cut through the noise. "We have breaking news from the Department of Defense regarding a missing Marine Staff Sergeant, decorated combat medic from Sanjin, last seen in 2014. The photograph filled the screen in high definition. Dress uniform. Sergeant chevrons. Eyes like a sniper's scope, locked and unblinking. The nameplate read, Staff Sergeant Brooke Sullivan, USMC. The lobby went silent. Absolute. The kind of silence where you could hear the fluorescent lights hum and buzz above like angry wasps trapped in a glass case. Behind the information desk, a young registration clerk named Sarah squinted at the television, then at her clipboard, then back at the television. She was holding a stack of intake forms for the chief nursing officer. The same woman who'd been escorted out of this building yesterday by security. The same woman whose badge had been deactivated at 0600 hours. Sarah's hands began to shake. A Navy SEAL commander in full dress uniform approached the Pentagon microphone, his bearing so rigid you could measure angles off his spine. He'd been admitted to Oak Creek Memorial's cardiac wing 4 days ago with a shrapnel wound that went septic. He'd coded on the operating table at 02 for 7 hours. He'd flatlined for 4 minutes before a trauma nurse with a face like carved granite opened his chest and brought him back with her bare hands. He had no idea who she was. Not until this morning, when his commanding officer called and said, "We found her. She's in Jacksonville. She works as a nurse." The commander's voice was steady as a submarine diesel when he spoke into the microphone. That nurse's real name is Staff Sergeant Brooke Sullivan. Marine Force Recon. That woman saved my life. The lobby erupted. Phones began ringing. Nurses who'd worked alongside Brooke for 8 years stared at the screen in disbelief. She was the quiet one. The one who'd corrected Dr. Hayes' dosage calculation without ego. The one who'd never complained about the demotion. The one who'd brought a lunchbox with a faded sticker of a dog tag on it every single day. A SEAL chaplain in dress whites approached the podium next. He opened a leather-bound log, Combat Casualty Records from Helmand Province, 2011 to 2014. His voice carried the weight of witness, 3 tours. 47 combat saves documented. She trained half the medics who served in Helmand Province between 2011 and 2014. No formal instruction. Just field work. Just keeping people alive in rooms with no walls. He paused. The camera held on his face. She did that while she was 23 years old. A rear admiral stepped to the microphone. His ribbon rack glinted under the lights, a constellation of color and weight earned in ways most people would never understand. His jaw moved like he was grinding bone. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Purple Heart with cluster. Each medal hung in the air like a separate sentence, a separate truth. The Purple Heart with cluster means she was wounded in combat more than once. And kept working. He looked directly at the camera, directly into the lobby of Oak Creek Memorial. My son was burning in the back of a Humvee in Sanjin in 2012. Staff Sergeant Sullivan pulled him out. Then she stitched his femoral artery together with paracord and morphine and will. His voice cracked slightly. That nurse was demoted yesterday for doing her job too well. The lobby was no longer silent. It was roaring. People were crying. Some were staring at their phones, frantically searching news sites for more information. Some were already making calls. Then a woman in a dark suit with no visible insignia approached the microphone. Her face was carved from stone. She introduced herself only as a representative of the Central Intelligence Agency. The room went so quiet you could hear car horns from the street outside, muffled by the double glass doors. Staff Sergeant Brooke Sullivan held a CIA asset designation during her time overseas, the woman said. Call sign, Seraph. She was authorized for autonomous tactical medical operations in denied territory. That means she made life and death decisions without chain of command clearance. Alone. In places where backup doesn't exist. The woman's eyes moved across the cameras like she could see through the screens directly into the hearts of everyone watching. The woman you fired yesterday had done things in that hospital that would make most combat surgeons weep. You had no idea who you were standing next to. Dr. Hayes was in his office. 3rd floor, administrative wing. He had the television on low volume, and now he was standing very still in front of it, his hands beginning to shake in a way that felt like betrayal. His own body refusing to obey commands. The color drained from his face in the exact order that understanding drained from his mind, first from his lips, then from his cheeks, then from his eyes until they looked like glass marble someone had left in a freezer. He turned off the television. He locked the door. He sat down at his desk and opened his computer with hands that had begun to tremble with a frequency that made typing impossible. His breathing was shallow, rapid, hyperventilation creeping in like hypothermia. He'd spent 3 years skimming surgical supply budgets. 3 years of inflated purchase orders, equipment marked up 400%, kickbacks deposited into an offshore account in Grand Cayman. 3 years of very careful, very methodical theft from a hospital that trusted him. And then a nurse, a floor nurse, nobody important, a woman he demoted in a parking lot to make an example of, had walked through the wrong operating room door and had quite literally saved the life of a Navy SEAL commander. A decorated, connected, powerful Navy SEAL commander who was apparently important enough to warrant a Pentagon press conference. Hayes's fingers moved across the keyboard with the desperation of a man trying to erase his own existence. He deleted security footage from the supply closet where he'd cornered Brooke. He deleted the email he'd sent to the state nursing board. He deleted the recordings of the parking lot demotion. He deleted message threads to his attorney. His breathing sounded like someone running through water. Deeper. Faster. Like he was drowning in air. What he didn't know was that Marcus Chen, the hospital's IT director, was a Navy veteran. 22 years in the Navy. Aircraft carrier, Persian Gulf, twice deployed to Kandahar in a communications role. Chen had been suspicious for months, small details that didn't add up, purchase orders that seemed inflated, a surgical supply budget that grew while the number of surgeries remained stable. But he hadn't acted on it. Not until he watched a woman get walked out of the building by security yesterday for doing her job too well, and then he watched Dr. Hayes begin deleting files this morning with the frantic energy of a man erasing evidence. Chen had been backing up Hayes's data stream since Tuesday. Every file. Every email. Every keystroke logged. The moment he watched Hayes begin the purge, Chen copied the external hard drive to 3 separate USB devices and walked out of the hospital at 1,340 hours wearing a coat that concealed what was in his pocket. He drove downtown in silence. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't make phone calls. He simply drove to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Jacksonville field office and walked to the white-collar crime division. The investigator's name was Special Agent Reeves. She was 54 years old and had spent 2 decades pursuing healthcare fraud cases. She listened to Chen's explanation for exactly 4 minutes before she took the external drive and began opening files. By 1600 hours, 2 other FBI agents had joined her at the terminal. By 1800 hours, they had drafted a search warrant. By midnight, federal agents were securing Dr. Hayes' office with evidence tape while Hayes sat in an interview room being read his Miranda rights by someone who worked for the United States government. His medical license was suspended within 48 hours. His attorney, the one he'd been calling to help destroy Brooke's career, called him at his home and said only, "I'm dropping you as a client effective immediately. I don't defend people who go after decorated service members." Then the line went dead. 6 months passed. Hayes' federal trial was scheduled. His offshore account was seized. His house was sold to pay restitution. He spent those 6 months trying to rebuild something from the ashes of his life, which was how he ended up at a folding table in a strip mall parking lot in Jacksonville, under a crooked banner that read Hayes Insurance Solutions in letters that were already fading in the Florida sun. No customers came. None had come for the 6 months he'd been sitting there. He was selling insurance now because nobody else would hire him. His professional credentials were toxins. His name was synonymous with fraud. Brooke Sullivan walked past that strip mall on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She was driving back to Oak Creek Memorial from a meeting with the hospital board, a meeting that had lasted exactly 3 hours and had resulted in the creation of a new position, Chief Nursing Officer. Appointed directly. No interview process. The board had negotiated with Brooke for 6 months to convince her to return. "We need you," the hospital president had said. "We need someone who understands what it means to do the work that matters." She'd accepted because her son needed stability and Oak Creek Memorial needed leadership that understood the difference between protocol and heroism. The strip mall was on her route. She saw the folding table. She saw the crooked banner. She saw the man sitting beneath it, older now, diminished, his body compressed into a chair that was too small for the weight of what he'd lost. She did not break stride. Her hand rested briefly on the dog tag beneath her chief nursing officer lanyard, the talisman she'd carried for 8 years, the symbol of a woman she'd buried so carefully that even she'd almost forgotten she was still underneath the scrubs and the deference and the carefully maintained composure. The dog tag was silver now. It no longer hung on a broken chain. It hung from a ribbon the color of dried blood, the ribbon of the Navy Cross. She drove on toward Oak Creek Memorial, toward the position that had been created for her, toward the surgery she was scheduled to oversee, toward the future that had revealed itself the moment a Navy SEAL commander's heart stopped beating and her hands had moved on their own. Muscle memory. Truth. The reclamation of a self that had never actually gone away. Behind her, in the rearview mirror, Dr. Hayes watched the car drive past. He saw her hand on the dog tag. He understood, in that moment, the full depth of his miscalculation. Not just that he'd attacked someone dangerous. That he'd attacked someone dangerous and lost everything while she'd gained the entire world. When Brooke arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, the lobby doors slid open before she stepped toward them, as if the building itself recognized her. The staff parted. No snickers. No mocking call signs. Just respect, earned not through titles but through the actions of a woman who'd been remade by war and had chosen to spend her remaking helping other people live. Commander Cross was waiting in the cardiology wing for his 6-month follow-up appointment. When Brooke walked into the examination room, he stood immediately. He was back on active duty. His scar tissue was healing clean. His heart was beating at exactly the rhythm it should. He extended his hand. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." She shook it. Her grip was steady. "Just doing the work, Commander. Your heart's perfect. Go back and keep saving lives." He smiled. 47 combat saves. How many of them know your name? She moved toward the door. They don't need to know my name. They just need to know they're alive. She closed the door behind her and continued down the corridor, and for the first time in 8 years, Brooke Sullivan walked through Oak Creek Memorial without pretending to be someone smaller than she actually was. If you're enjoying this, smash that like button. And answer me this: would you have signed the NDA and taken the money, or fought back? Comments are open.